No one wants to hear that the airplane that they are on has lost power. Thankfully, it's a very rare occurrence, especially on commercial airliners where multiple people and systems are supposed to prevent any problems before the flight takes off. But it certainly does happen. Perhaps most famously here in the United States with U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the so-called Miracle on the Hudson. Sully's plane lost power just after takeoff at just 2,800 feet. But in 1983, a very different flight lost power to staggering 41,000 feet, giving its pilots no choice but to try to land the wide-bodied commercial airliner without engines. And that Canadian flight would go down in history as it landed outside a small town in rural Manitoba that had the same name as one of the dwarves in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
Gliders are a kind of plane specifically designed to glide, that is, fly through the air unpowered but in controlled flight. Essentially, the wings of a glider produce lift, and the faster the glider goes, the more lift those wings can provide. But the plane cannot glide forever, because just as the speed improves lift, it also increases drag, which slows the glider down. The best way to maintain flight is to gain speed, which can be done by angling the glider down, essentially trading altitude for speed. Gliders tend to be as light as possible and incredibly aerodynamic to get the most glide time out of the air as possible before they are inevitably forced to land. Commercial planes, like the Boeing 767, a wide-bodied aircraft 159 foot 2 inches long with a wingspan of 156 feet 1 inch, are not designed to glide, but maintain lift instead by the force of their engines. However, all planes can glide, though not as efficiently as ones designed for it. On July 23, 1983, 61 passengers boarded Air Canada Flight 143 for service from Montreal to Edmonton. All of the many mistakes and problems that would cause the incident were already in place. The flight was on board a Boeing 767, among the first of its kind to be flown by Air Canada and only in service since March. In fact, the 767 was only first introduced the year before, when the first 767 entered service with United Airlines in September 1982. While their introduction was considered smooth, they did run into some problems with the fuel quality indication system, the plane's fuel gauge. Boeing had already issued a bulletin to routinely check the system. The day before those passengers boarded, an engineer in Edmonton had checked the system. If working properly, the system was supposed to calculate the amount of fuel in the plane via two separate channels, which then tested against each other to confirm the reading. If one of the channels failed, the system could still detect the amount of gas, but it needed to be double-checked via a manual reading on the ground to ensure it was correct. The problem was that in reality, if one of the switches failed, the entire system was disabled and wouldn't display the fuel reading. The engineer discovered a workaround when he disabled the second breaker, which allowed the functional channel to measure the fuel level. He put a tag over the disabled breaker. By the morning of July 23rd, the plane had landed back in Montreal. As they prepared to fuel the plane, the ground crew worker who was supposed to measure the system manually decided to check the system while he waited for the fueler to arrive. He had no authority or training to tinker with the system, but the engineer's note in the log didn't make sense to him, so he turned the second channel back on. Instantly, the plane's fuel gauges failed, displaying nothing on the screen. He could have fixed it, but before he could investigate further, the fueler arrived and he left the cockpit. He left the tag that indicated that the breaker had been pulled, but it no longer was. The investigation report that this well-intended but misguided curiosity contributed significantly to the subsequent accident. Safeguards were still in place to prevent disaster. As Captain Bob Pearson and his first officer, Maurice Quintal, arrived, they spoke with the departing captain, who mentioned that there was a problem with the fuel system and that the plane had been flying like that for at least a few days. Pearson took that to mean that the fuel gauges were completely inoperable. Pearson still took the situation seriously and examined the minimum equipment list, which indicated that the plane could not be flown with disabled fuel gauges. However, he still thought the plane had been flying with bad gauges and was under the impression that a dipstick measurement would suffice. Additionally, the minimum equipment list had been edited extensively in the handful of months the 767 had been in service, 55 times to be exact, and some pages were completely blank as procedures were not even developed. According to testimony during the investigation, he believed that the maintenance crew had a different, more complete list, and that the maintenance had the authority to declare the plane flyable, even if the equipment list said it couldn't. Pearson claimed that a maintenance officer specifically said that the plane was legal to operate. Despite the numerous mistakes, the plane was still on the ground, waiting for fuel, and the disaster was not inevitable. Quite yet. The dipstick measurement technique has 3 steps. The drip, or measurement of the fuel depth in the tanks in centimeters, followed by the conversion of the dipstick reading in centimeters to the volume in liters, and finally the conversion of the volume in liters to weight in kilograms. The last step is important because it's vital to know a plane's weight during flight.
It's important to note at this point that the Canadian aviation industry was in the process of transitioning from imperial to metric, and the Boeing 767 was the only plane in the Air Canada fleet that used metric measurements.
As the plane was preparing to take off on July 23rd, the drip measurement was taken to determine how much fuel was already on board. They only needed to add enough for the plane to reach Edmonton, but none of the ground crew or pilots were actually trained to do those calculations. The 767 was the first wide-body jet Boeing had built that had a 2-person cockpit and not 3. A presidential task force had determined 2 was safe only 2 years before. That removed crew member was the second officer, and it would have been his job to do the calculation. His responsibilities had not been firmly reassigned, and none of the 4 men working on the plane had been trained to manually calculate the fuel level. They obtained the initial fuel volume of 7,682 liters, which then needed to be converted into kilograms and subtracted from the 22,300 kilograms of fuel needed to make the flight. The Blue Book used by the maintenance crew gave them the density of the fuel at 1.77, but unknown to the crew was that the number was in pounds per liter, not kilograms per liter, and the correct number should have been 0.8. The calculations were checked several times, including by computer, as the maintenance crew were not confident in their calculations, but always with the incorrect conversion. Instead of adding the 49,170 pounds of fuel needed, they added only 22,300. The fueler himself had no idea what amount was needed or where the plane was flying, and so noticed no error.
And that is how, unbeknownst to the crew or 61 passengers, that Canada Air Flight 143 took off that July morning with less than half the fuel that it needed to reach Edmonton.
By inputting the numbers manually, the fuel gauges could determine fuel consumption, but they were working off incorrect numbers. The plane landed briefly in Ottawa, where the fuel levels were measured again, but incredibly the same mistake was repeated by the fueler in Ottawa, who gave the density at the incorrect number, leading Pearson to input that he had 45,000 pounds of fuel, when he actually only had 20,400. It was evening when the plane left Ottawa, but the first hour of the 1,775-mile flight was routine. Around 8 p.m., Quintel spoke to the passengers. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your first officer. We're presently coming up over Red Lake and are cruising at 41,000 feet. In Edmonton, it's a beautiful day." Shortly after, things started to go wrong. The first indication was a beeping warning that fuel pressure was wrong in the left fuel pump. At that point, Pearson said, "We believed we had a failed fuel pump in the left wing and switched the alarm off." Everything he knew suggested he had enough fuel, but minutes later, a second warning displayed on another pump. Pearson decided to divert to Winnipeg and requested emergency clearance. Next, the left engine went out entirely. Immediately, they began preparing for a single-engine landing, which was bad enough. But as they finished preparations, another sound echoed. The other engine had gone out. "It's a sound that Bob and I had never heard before," Quintel said. "It's not in the simulator." The time was 8:21. The situation was worse than that, as the 767 had a new electronic flight instrument system that relies on electricity produced by the engines. The cockpit had only a handful of still functioning systems that had batteries, including the radio, and even the hydraulic pressure was failing, making most of the plane's controls inoperable. The cockpit became the blackest place in the world, according to Pearson. The only reason they were able to maneuver at all was thanks to a final failsafe, the ram air turbine, or RAT. The RAT is a propeller-driven hydraulic pump, which allowed the plane to have just enough pressure to perform a dead-stick landing.
No commercial aircraft that size had ever successfully managed a dead-stick landing. No one had ever landed a Boeing 767 without power.
Fortunately, Pearson was an experienced glider pilot and had the skills necessary to keep the plane nominally flying. Quintel got busy with the manuals, hoping for instructions on what to do in the event of a no-engine landing, but the concept was so remote that it hadn't even been considered nor practiced on simulators. Pearson transmitted a mayday call. "We require vector onto the closest available runway," Pearson radioed. About that time, the flight attendants were directing the passengers to prepare for an emergency landing. Pearson quickly did calculations for the best speed for a long glide, choosing 220 knots. He had trouble using the onboard magnetic compass, so I steered by the clouds beneath us, the captain said, and assistance from the tower at Winnipeg. The tower had lost contact with the plane's transponder, and they were tracking it by radar. The plane was descending more quickly than expected, and Quintel, doing his own calculations, realized that the plane was not going to make it to Winnipeg. Quintel suggested using instead the military strip at Gimli, Manitoba, slightly nearer, a base Quintel was familiar with from serving with the military. Another stroke of luck.
Unfortunately, the military base had been shut down, and unknown to the crew, one of the former runways had been transformed into a race track, which was in use at that very moment. A guardrail had been placed through the middle of the runway.
They reached the site of the airfield, but they were still going too fast. Pearson decided to do something not recommended in a big jet like the 767, but used more often in light aircraft, called a slip, which would increase drag and decrease altitude. It involved the plane leaning one wing down. "It was an odd feeling," Quintel said later. "I was up compared to Bob. I sort of looked down at him." Without power, they had to drop the landing gear by gravity drop to lock it in position. 2 lights went green, but the nose gear didn't lock. The plane was nearly silent on approach, and there was no way to warn the unsuspecting race crowd. The runway was short, and at its end were numerous tents, cars, and civilians attending the event. A golf course sat nearby. The pilots noticed 2 boys on the runway so close Pearson later said that he could see the terror on their faces. One of the passengers is said to have remarked, "Christ, I can almost see what clubs they are using." The plane hit the landing strip, Pearson trying to straddle the guardrail. With spectators fleeing, he slammed on the brakes, hard enough to cause an explosion to rock the plane as 2 tires blew out. The nose gear collapsed with a huge bang, forcing the front of the plane down, bounced hard, hit again. Plane came to a stop 100 feet from barbecues, campers, and spectators. No one was injured, but a fire broke out forward, and the crew hurried to get the passengers off the plane. The odd angle made the rear emergency slide sit at an extreme angle, and the only reported injuries came from passengers hitting the ground too hard as they exited. A watching Cessna pilot called the landing impeccable.
The investigation after the fact criticized the pilots, the mechanics, and Air Canada for having a mixed fleet, for poor training, for not doing as they appropriately should have, grounding the aircraft. Pearson was initially demoted for 6 months, and Quintel was given a 2-week suspension. Pearson criticized the suspension, but he ended up flying for Air Canada for another 10 years, and Quintel would fly for years afterwards as well.
The incident led procedures and training to change not just at Air Canada, but at other airlines as well, including the recommendation to move all Air Canada planes to metric from imperial units.
In recognition of their extraordinary landing, the pilots were given the first diplomas for outstanding airmanship by the World Air Sports Federation in 1985. The plane was repaired, served with Air Canada for nearly another 25 years. Both pilots and some of the original flight attendants were on board the Gimli glider for its last flight in 2008, after which it was retired and left in the Mojave Desert. Maurice Quintel passed away in 2015, but Captain Pearson is still alive as of April 2022. In an ironic twist, after the landing, a maintenance crew was dispatched to begin repairs. They got lost in the Manitoba wilderness and reportedly ran out of gas. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.